There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist and consultant to the U.S. State Department. Joining us from Brussels is Guy Burton. He's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics Middle East Center. Barbara Slavin is the director of the Atlantic Council's Future of Iran initiative. And also with us from Brussels is Adnan Tabatabai. He's an Iran analyst and the CEO of CARPO, a Middle East policy center. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Adnan, let me start with you. We've been hearing a lot of words being exchanged between Iran and the United States over the past few weeks. U.S. officials are now telling us that the United States has deterred Iran from threatening actions against the United States. President Trump has been speaking about this as well. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
With Iran, we'll see what happens, but they've been very hostile. They've truly been the #1 provocateur of terror. We have no indication that anything's happened or will happen, but if it does, it will be met, obviously, with great force. We'll have no choice. If they called, we would certainly negotiate, but that's going to be up to them. I'd only want them to call if they're ready. If they're not ready, they don't have to bother.
So, Adnan, let's clarify a few things here. Firstly, what are the threats that Iran has made against the United States that President Trump is talking about?
Probably President Trump is referring to Iran's statements that it would retaliate if any form of action is undertaken against Iran in the region. At the same time, I guess it has also to do with the sanctions regime imposed on Iran that makes life very difficult, not only for the state of the Islamic Republic, but also for the people, and that Iran feels it has to respond. And possibly those responses could be on the ground in the region and possibly what President Trump is referring to.
Right, but those would be retaliations. That would not be Iran taking action against the United States in the first instance.
I wouldn't see that, no.
Okay, John, the United States has not divulged the intelligence it claims it has on an imminent Iranian threat. This is how the Iranian Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, responded to President Trump's suggestion that Iran calls him.
We are not willing to talk to people who have broken their promises. Because we talked to people, we did not believe that our nuclear program, our nuclear energy program required us to provide any concessions or provide any confidence-building measures. But we engaged, we acted in good faith, we negotiated, we reached a deal. What the United States is saying is that we make a deal, whatever we can get you in the negotiations through the deal is fine. Whatever we cannot get you, we'll come back to try to get you. This is not the way serious countries deal with each other.
John, does the Iranian foreign minister have a point there? The United States did walk away from the deal.
The Trump administration declared that it would no longer abide by the JCPOA based on what candidate Trump had been stating for 2 years he would do, and what probably any Republican would have done if another Republican had won the presidency. My own sense is that the Iranian government, entering into that agreement in 2015, believed that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president of the United States, and that they had a long-term approach to this agreement with the United States and with the other major powers. So that strategy has been completely upended, and I don't know that Iran has been able to fully comprehend that there's not only a different government in Washington, D.C., but a completely different style of dealing with Iran and any other country that the Trump administration considers to be a rogue regime. But North Korea and Iran are at the top of that heap right now, and Iran is getting the Trump treatment the way that Kim Jong-un and North Korea did in early 2017.
Right. John, that is despite the fact that Iran, by all accounts, including those we are getting from UN inspectors, has been abiding by the terms of the deal.
It has been abiding by the terms of the deal to the extent that the deal allowed for Iran to declare sites where nuclear development was taking place, but those sites that were being alleged to have been used for those purposes were not open to UN inspectors. The Trump administration believes that the fact that the deal itself excluded any considerations for Iran's ballistic missile technology development and for Iran's ongoing state sponsorship of terrorism made the deal itself faulty. So even if there were all of these technical criteria with which Iran may have been adhering, these other strategic problems, these strategic gaps in the JCPOA rendered it relatively worthless in the president's eyes.
Can I just beg to differ? I'm not sure that another Republican would have walked out of the agreement. I think it's entirely possible that they would have tried to perhaps negotiate a follow-on deal or other understandings, as the Trump administration began to do. But the way in which the Trump administration left the agreement has caused a tremendous rift with Europe, with other countries. It has weakened the United States, weakened U.S. leverage over Iran. So I think this has been a very mistaken path. In terms of the so-called threats in the region, yeah, they're real, but we have to look at the reason behind them. The United States has imposed a total embargo on Iran's export of oil. And Iran's response is to show that, yes, we can inflict pain, we can cause the price of oil to go up. And there have been attacks, as we know, on tankers in the Persian Gulf, on some Saudi facilities, oil facilities. And this is Iran's way of showing that they have an ability also to counter American aggression, namely the economic aggression of the Trump administration.
But Barbara, looking at the broader picture here, is there a risk here that what the United States has done could become the new normal, that future presidents don't have to abide by what their predecessors have done?
I hope not. I think this has done tremendous damage to United States standing in the world. This agreement was blessed by the UN Security Council. There are other agreements that the Trump administration has walked away from as well, and I think that's quite unfortunate. I would hope a future administration would be able to get bipartisan support for a policy toward Iran, and that perhaps we could have legislation, not necessarily a treaty, but legislation that would get rid of certain sanctions against Iran in return for concrete actions by the Iranians. Maybe that's the future of the JCPOA going forward after 2021.
Guy, you know, in the past, many of the United States allies in Europe have marched almost in lockstep with the United States on foreign policy issues, like issues in the Middle East. But this is what the New York Times reported a few days ago. It said that with strong memories of the last catastrophic war in Iraq, Europeans are united in opposing what many consider the United States' efforts to provoke Iran into a shooting war. So is it fair to say, Guy, that Europeans at this stage are going to have nothing to do with President Trump's position on Iran?
Well, it seems that the Europeans, on the one hand, want to maintain the deal. On the other hand, it's not quite clear exactly what they're doing to actually make that happen, that a reality. One of the things that they've tried to put into place after the United States left, the threat of sanctions meant that the Europeans had to look and try and create a special purpose vehicle to enable financial payments to be made to Iran. But that took until January for that to actually sort of reach the European Council. And even then, within the Council, there was disputes and differences amongst the member states. And as far as I understand it, it's still not fully operational.
John?
I don't have any sense, at least here in Washington, D.C., I don't know what our European allies and counterparts may be thinking, that the Trump administration is trying to provoke Iran into a war. Remember, first of all, that, again, candidate Trump, and I take his pledges seriously, even if people disagree with his policies, and he made very clear that he considered the wars in the Middle East, quote-unquote, stupid wars. I don't think he has any interest in another war in the Middle East, one that would be far more deleterious to the U.S. military and to our allies than anything that took place in Iraq or Afghanistan, if in an unprovoked fashion. What I think they are pursuing is a very robust, very muscular strategy of deterrence through containment, and they've made very clear, if Iran does attack U.S. interests, or attacks the U.S. military in any way, there will be an overwhelming response. So I think they're looking to make sure that the Iranians understand that retaliation will be massive and overwhelming, but it's retaliation. It's not a first strike, and they're not looking to start another war, especially a year and a half before the presidential election next year.
Adnan, I just want to get back to a point that Barbara made earlier on. Would the Iranians, if this deal had not been withdrawn, would the Iranians have been open to further negotiations with the United States to basically improve on the agreement that was already signed?
For that to happen, the actual deal would have needed to actually work properly. Iran has made clear, from the person of the Supreme Leader up to the President and to others, that if the JCPOA is in fact a successful model of diplomacy, not only with the US but in a multilateral setting, Iran would be open to future talks about other issues. And I would also disagree with the notion that the Iranian banked on a democratic candidate being re-elected. I think what the Iranians actually thought was that any president, regardless of the party, would actually abide by something which is backed, as Barbara mentioned, by the UN Security Council. So I, in fact, believe that the Iranians would really try and see whether this deal, as it stands, works, and if it doesn't, there won't be negotiations about future deals, at least not in the short term.
And now we have a situation where this deal seems to be going in reverse. There are reports, Associated Press for one in the United States has been reporting that Iran has increased its uranium enrichment capacity and could soon exceed the stockpile limitations that was set out by the JCPOA, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which we call the nuclear deal. What are we to make of that?
I believe this is a situation in which the Iranians are trying to say, we mean business. For 1 year after the U.S. withdrawal, the Iranians showed strategic patience. They didn't react in any shape or form. They kept implementing the JCPOA properly. With the recent wave of sanctions imposed on May 3rd by the U.S., Iran is no longer allowed to ship abroad its excess in uranium and heavy water, which is basically part of the JCPOA. And that makes it even impossible, at least very difficult for Iran to abide by its obligations. And in order to preempt being called out for not abiding by this obligation, Iran has said we won't be able to do it. And they're now producing in a quadruple speed in order to show that they will reach this point and no longer accept this limit as it is undermined by the U.S.
Guy, even with Iran increasing its enrichment capacity, even with the United States pulling out of this deal, there have been calls to the Europeans to step in, try to salvage the deal. Foreign Minister Zarif, in fact, has appealed to both Russia and China as well. But do you see this nuclear deal being salvaged at all?
The Iranians are being quite forceful because they're trying to push the Europeans to stand up for this deal. But we've also got to think that there's also domestic constituency here as well. But bearing in mind that Rouhani, the Iranian president, comes from the reformist wing, and there was always some doubts, at least on the hardline side in Iran, as to the deal. So this sort of pushing and stressing the fact that they're going to push for further enrichment is also sort of a sign to the hardline tendencies within Iran as well.
Barbara, what are your thoughts on that? That there are these divisions in Iran.
Now, there are divisions, although I would say the divisions are less than what we've seen in the past. I think this kind of pressure tends to make even a fractious political system like Iran's become more unified. And you've heard Rouhani, I wouldn't call him a reformist. He comes from a kind of pragmatic wing in Iran, identified with the late President Rafsanjani. He sounded more in favor of the so-called resistance economy or resilient economy. And I think he certainly has been much more hardline in his language about the United States, as one would expect. So I think it actually will unify the Iranian system. They've been very careful. I mean, they are crawling out of the Iran deal. It's very calibrated, it's very careful. They've given the Europeans 60 days, essentially, to make this special purpose vehicle function in some way. We may see some political gestures by the Europeans, some sort of summitry, perhaps foreign ministers flying to Tehran as they did back in 2003 when the nuclear crisis began. And the Iranians are looking for the Chinese in particular to buy oil and to keep their economy afloat. I think if that happens, they may breach some of the limits on low enriched uranium, but they won't do anything really provocative like enriching to higher levels. Enriching at 20% again, which gets you close to the path to a bomb. Their basic strategy is to try to survive until our 2020 elections and hope that either a new president will come in or that President Trump might change his personnel and also his approach in the second term, which has been known to happen. It happened under George W. Bush, and it could happen under Trump.
Talking about change in personnel, John, how much of a difference is there between President Trump's view on how to deal with Iran and his two top aides on foreign policy, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, John Bolton being the National Security Advisor and Pompeo being the Secretary of State?
Well, we know for the record that as it pertains to John Bolton, they have very different personal perspectives, right? John Bolton was quite open, especially in a famous New York Times editorial or op-ed, where he called on bombing Iran to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. But when Bolton was appointed NSC advisor, he made very clear that he's serving the president. And so his opinions are his, and he's carrying out the president's decisions.
He also talked not so long ago about regime change in Iran.
President is not talking about regime change, and you're not hearing much about this from the officials in the White House or the State Department. But here's the thing. I think the larger Trump strategy is to simply keep Iran and its potential allies completely off balance. It has been a very inconsistent message. There has been talk about the official end to Iran in a Trump tweet just several days ago if Iran provokes the United States. On the other hand, the president hopes that there's no war with Iran. On the other hand, if the Supreme Leader is willing to meet with President Trump, they'll do a fantastic deal just the way President Trump would like to do with Kim Jong-un. The Iranians can't figure out any messaging from Washington, D.C. in any consistent manner, and I think that's very deliberate.
Adnan, how badly are these U.S.-led sanctions hitting Iran? You know, we heard not so long ago from Foreign Minister Zarif, who said that when it comes to sanctions, Iran has a PhD in sanctions busting. He also said this recently. Let's watch this.
The United States is engaging in economic warfare against Iran. It has to stop. Economic war means targeting Iranian people. That has to stop. The United States does not have the legal position, does not have the moral position, does not have the political position, does not have the international position to impose economic war on Iran. Iran is not interested in escalation. We have said very clearly that we will not be the party to begin escalation, but we will defend ourselves. Now, having all these military assets in a small waterway is in and of itself prone to accident, particularly when you have people who are interested in accidents. So extreme prudence is required, and we believe that the United States is playing a very, very dangerous game.
So Adnan, listening to the foreign minister there, on the one hand, it's, he talks about having a PhD in sanctions busting, but when we listen to what he's saying there, it seems that Iran is feeling the pressure.
Well, of course, such a sanctions regime has its impact. We have to mention, and this is openly and very vividly discussed in Iran, that the Iranian economy has its homemade problems, from mismanagement to corruption, patronage, etc. That is basically something that is openly discussed up to the highest levels of the state. But obviously, a sanctions regime like the one that the U.S. is now imposing exacerbates the hardship that the homemade economic problems are causing for the Iranian people. And let's be clear about the fact that a sanctioned country is in fact unable to do healthy economic process in any shape or form. The private sector is more than ever dependent on state channels to do any form of international, or be it transport transaction. So you actually raise the dependency of the Iranian people, you cripple the private sector, while the state obviously has its own channels to circumvent sanctions. And let's not forget that the 2 years in which we were hopeful about the JCPOA working were actually an exception in now 40 years of the Islamic Republic, in which this political system, for a host of reasons, had to withstand U.S. pressure. And that is what Foreign Minister Zarif refers to when he says a PhD in sanctions circumvention. So there will be a way to survive, I guess, because the Iranian system is used to that. But that doesn't mean proper economic growth and sustainable development, unfortunately.
John?
I think Iran's leaders really need to have seriously rethink the way they have structured their governance model over the last 40 years. Iran remains completely dependent, essentially, on oil exports to sustain its economy. And in the meantime, they have killed about 600 American soldiers in Iraq through the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They attempted to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. The Europeans uncovered a Parisian assassination plot, a terrorist plot, just last year. Why would you engage in all of these kinds of actual warfare activities, to use the Iranian foreign minister's terms, when you're completely dependent on oil exports to sustain your people and your society? And economic warfare, I think, is a misnomer. The United States is using maximum leverage, not forcing anybody to do anything except to choose. Would you like to do business with the United States, or would you like to do business with the American implacable foe in the Middle East? You decide. It's up to you.
Barbara?
First of all, the Iranian economy does rely to some extent on oil, but it's become actually much more independent of oil. I think it's about 40% of the economy at this point. Iran is a large country. It has agriculture. It has light manufacturing. And the result of sanctions is actually to force the Iranians to become more independent, more self-reliant. So I rather disagree with that. No one can defend Iran's support for terrorism. I think these are very counterproductive and illegal actions by the Iranian government. But if you look at Iran's influence in the region, most of that comes from American mistakes, some would even say crimes, namely the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which overturned Saddam Hussein and opened the country to Iranian influence, put a Shia government in power. If you look at Lebanon, an Israeli invasion in 1982 led to the formation of Hezbollah, which we now call a terrorist group. So, you know, it's been a very unhealthy and unfortunate dynamic, I would say, between the United States and Iran over the last 40 years, and there's a lot that people on both sides need to do. The current policy of the Trump administration will only entrench the worst instincts of Iran. It will cripple the middle class, it will cripple private enterprise, and we will be much farther from the sort of Iran I think Iranians and most of the rest of the world would like to see.
Guy, we've seen how Europeans have borne the consequences of instability in the Middle East, particularly the civil war in Syria. So how much concern is there in Europe that if this escalates, if this dispute between the United States and Iran escalates to the point possibly of some kind of military confrontation, that they will bear the consequences again?
I think, to be honest with you, the Europeans are still sort of handling what happened after the summer of 2015 with the Syrian refugees. One of the things that they did after that, into 2015, was to set a number of deals and agreements with the neighboring countries like Turkey for them to take refugees. But in terms of thinking about the nature of the type of conflicts that might happen, I mean, I'd be very curious to hear from John as to, you know, whether it would be sort of a full frontal, you know, state-to-state conflict, or more something in line with what we've been seeing recently, which is much more sort of asymmetric. The possibility of deniability seems to emerge with regard to sort of attacks on tankers or pipelines.
Go ahead, John.
I have no idea what kind of military options are being considered. I know that we now have a significant force that is headed to the region. Much of it is already pre-positioned there as well. And I think the administration wants to make very clear that unfortunately, all military options will remain on the table so long as Iran sustains the kind of rhetoric and the kind of activity in the region and directly against the United States that it has been doing since 1979.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But before we go, this week we launch our own podcast. You can listen to it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering similar stories from around the world that we do right here on the program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just out for a run, give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search online for CGTN and The Heat podcast. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.